Greetings to our Canadian friend, Paul Fromm. He joins us again. Now, you have just thrown your hat in the ring, and I believe the election's been decided for the mayor of Hamilton. How was that campaign?
Well, if you're asking the results, I improved my vote a couple of hundred votes over last time, but it was very disappointing, really. I put a tremendous amount of effort into it, and because I was the subject of a double whammy media boycott and then media smears. So the only thing that would appear about me and my candidacy would either be a smear or they would ignore me. And I've been warned about this by a fellow who'd done a lot of work with the populist People's Party of Canada and with the Conservative Party. And he said Hamilton is run by a very leftist elite. And what they'll try to do is just basically freeze you out. And that's what they did. So my counter strategy had to be to go out and meet people. You can't rely on the media to carry your message. In fact, if the media mentions you, it's going to be a smear. And it was. And I met a lot of people. I met a lot of very good people, and I met some very nasty people. There's quite Hamilton's a labor town. It's a big steel mills. And there is quite a left-wing element in Hamilton, but there's also quite a populist element and some conservatives as well. So it's not a hopeless place, but the left has quite a network. And I've campaigned in, I think I've run for election 11 times over several decades in several levels of government. And I've actually never had somebody be directly hostile. I've had people say, well, I'm not interested, or I don't vote, or things like that. But I've never had absolute hostility. And I ran into, these people are predictable. They're all white. Almost always they are in their late middle ages. They're women, short buzz haircut, fat face, unhappy looking, sour, dressed like, they being dressed at the Salvation Army. So one was said to me, I can't accept that. You're a white supremacist. I said, well, how do you know that? Do you know me? Oh, you're a white supremacist. And the interesting thing is that they would never take a piece of literature, nor would they discuss. They already knew I was a white supremacist. Another person said, you can't come in here. You're a Holocaust denier and a white supremacist. I said, you don't know me. You're making what are you making that judgment on what basis? Another woman went by me. I campaign outside of liquor stores and supermarkets. It's a good place to meet people. And this woman she actually hissed, you fucking Nazi pig. Talking about pigs, you're more on the hefty side than I am. But there was that element. But I don't want to suggest I was anywhere near even a sizable minority. It was the odd exception, but it occurred often enough. But what the papers and television did here was to exclude me or smear me. Generally, the cable TV network has all candidates debate for mayor, and then separate all candidates debates for councillors ward by ward. Okay, well, I received notice of the all candidates debate, but then there was a very mysterious paragraph of, in the interest of, I don't know what it was, various criteria, like whether you've run before, your impact on the community, and so on, will be taken into account as to whether you'll be invited to the debate. Each of us got 2 minutes to record a little blurb, but the really interesting thing will be a debate where you can have a clash of ideas or personalities. And 4 years ago, they did have a debate. There were 14 candidates, and we all got a chance to make our points. This time there were 9 candidates, and they decided that they would whittle it down to just 3. Well, I asked, what do your criteria mean? If you mean impact on the community, I would say I'm probably the 3rd best known of the 9 candidates. One was a former mayor from years ago. One was a provincial politician. She's a socialist. Her party got defeated, heavily lost a lot in the last provincial election a few months ago, but she retained her seat, but she decided she'd run for mayor. So she's well known. And then I would say I was, well, put my name into Google, you'll find quite a bit of information. Not necessarily good information, but so in a tiny puddle, I'm sort of famous. Well, run before. Well, would that be positive or negative? I've run before for that office and for other offices. One of the 3 people who was invited has never run before. So their criteria were so mushy, you didn't know what they meant, and they didn't answer me. Anyway, I was excluded from that debate. There were several other all candidates debates that I didn't even know about, but found out subsequently at other venues. There was then a webinar, whatever that is. I was invited 5 times to that. So I showed up the night of the webinar, which I take it was going to be a discussion among various politicians or would-be politicians, and people would have to pay to watch it. I think that's what it was about. So I arrived at the venue, which is the Hamilton Main Library, and the event was to be at 7. I arrived at about 6:45, and it's clocked. And this shows you something about the what's happening in this city. Well, why would the public library be locked at 7 o'clock on a Friday night? Anyway, I hailed the security guard and told him what I was there for. Oh, he said yes, it's just down the hall, so he let me in. As soon as I got in, this really pushy little guy comes over to me. You're not invited. You're a neo-Nazi, and so you're a Holocaust denier and a white supremacist. Again, I said to him, "Who are you? Yeah, you don't know me. Yeah. No, I know. I've seen you on I've seen your videos, and they're disgusting. And you're a supporter of the Nazis and blah 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 blah." I said, "Well, I have an invitation." In fact, your people have invited me, I think, 5 times. As soon as the names of the people nominated to run was out there, I was starting to get invitations. I said, "I have an invitation. I'm not crashing your party. No, you're not invited. You're uninvited." I said, "Well, would you sign that? Would you give me a letter to that effect?" He actually wrote it, signed it. He said, "I was in the armed forces and I learned about democracy. You have the right to run, but you don't have the right to be here." I said, "What armed forces were you in? North Korea?" he didn't like that.
Is that legal?
Pardon?
Is that legal for him to do that?
Well, it's a private gathering,
But he's interfering in an election. That doesn't. I mean, I believe we've got laws that cover that sort of thing. Do they extend to mayoral candidacies, Jim?
Well,
here, yeah, there are laws about political interference, but they're not taken too far. You can't necessarily, I mean, I've been a candidate like Paul's been, and often I've never had the invitation at all, or I've been given the invitation, and the alternate candidates get 2 minutes, and the 2 mainstream political parties get 10 each. So if you only got 2 minutes, you better make a bloody good use of it. That's all I can say. So it seems you've got a lot of censorship in Canada, Paul.
Oh, yeah, and it's exactly as that old political operative told me. They just try to squeeze you out. Well, that's one side. And then our communist, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the local outlet in Hamilton called me up early in the campaign, and they wanted to ask me some questions. So the first reporter who sends me an email signs off preferred pronouns, he, him. And I didn't really understand. I asked my good friend who's been to prison, Dr. Jim Sears. He was in prison not for anything nefarious, but because he contravened our hate law. I said, I don't understand this. What does it mean? He said, well, the current politically correct thing is to, somewhere in your correspondence, to indicate what pronouns you'd prefer to have used on. I'd already written back to this character, if you don't know what the heck your sex is, don't bother me. I don't want to talk to you. So they sent some woman to ask me the question. So here are the questions. Bernie Farber, who heads up the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, it's largely funded by the government and by scumbag corporations. But he was formerly, for many years, the CEO of the old Canadian Jewish Congress. So he's a longtime enemy of free speech. So he's been putting it out that it's just terrible that neo-Nazis, his term, not mine, run in elections, and then they get access to the voters list. And they could use this access to, well, I don't know, maybe set up another Holocaust or something. It's all total bullshit. You know, nobody has ever been accused, at least none of the people I know who are populists or right or center, run for elections, ever been accused of misusing the voters list. And quite frankly, I had access to the voters list. I didn't use it because it was no use to me. What would I use it for? But it might be useful only if I was going to mail to every eligible voter. Okay, it could be a mailing list, I guess, but it had no relevance to me. I never even accessed it. But that was the big, bodice ripper of a story. Bernie Farber concerned about, he doesn't even live in Hamilton. He lives way off in Ottawa. Then they asked some local anti-racists. Oh yeah, they're very concerned about it. So that's about 60% of the story on my candidacy. And then the story. So I did get a chance to put my 2 cents worth in on that. And then the rest of the story is really mischievous. It says, and Paul Fromm has been associated with various groups like the Citizens for Foreign Aid Reform, which is opposed to all foreign aid. Well, that's not true. The Canada First Immigration Reform Committee that is opposed to non-whites being coming to Canada. Well, that's not exactly true. And then the Canadian Association for Free Expression, which defends Holocaust deniers and anti-LGBTQ people. I was never asked for a response on any of those. And so that is where people would get the impression, a Holocaust denier, white supremacist, etc. And the journalistic trick is they don't ask you what well, we've heard that this is the case. Well, what do you say? Which would at least be the pretense of balanced journalism. So that was out there quite a bit. And then there are 2 local TV channels. And the day I voted, I saw the van for CHCH, Channel 11, that's the local TV news, out in the parking lot. I thought, well, maybe they're covering the advanced poll. So the reporter had been talking to somebody, and that person moved away. So I went over, and he was a very friendly guy. He said, well, actually, we're not here about the advanced poll. We're covering the impact of a big scandal at Hockey Canada on local hockey in Hamilton. I said, oh yeah. And I said, well, actually, I'm running for mayor. He said, well, yeah, our channel is going to be doing interviews with all the mayoral candidates. I said, well, perhaps your news director has lost my phone number. Here it is. He says, oh, yes, I'll bring that up, but it's not my decision. It's editorial. I said, well, okay, but is this all candidates? He said, oh, yes, they're going to be interviewing all the candidates for mayor. Well, Needless to say, I never saw Channel 11 again. So it's really dirty in a very modern, sophisticated, controlled sort of way. It's not the old dirty tricks of smashing down the signs of your opponents, or trying to break up your opponents' meetings and things like that. It's very subtle, but still nonetheless controlled.
It comes from the top down. This is a
Oh,
quote
yes.
from your Prime Minister. The very concept of a nation founded by European settlers is offensive to me. Old stock white Canadians are an unpleasant relic and quite frankly replaceable, and we will replace them.
Oh, and take him absolutely seriously. The Great Replacement is at work at warp speed in Canada. It didn't start with this Trudeau. It basically started with his daddy back in roughly 1968. There's the dates of our change from a largely European Commonwealth immigration policy to throw open the doors to the third world was basically not around 1965, which is exactly the same year the Americans changed from their very balanced immigration policy flowing out of the Immigration Act of 1924 to again throw open the doors. But both major parties ever since, the Liberals and the Conservatives, so-called, are all on board for massive immigration, 85% from the third world, which means basically, the old stock Canadians, or in Quebec, the Québécois de souche, which is, it's hard to translate. Well, word for word, it's like the roots, but really what it really means, the best translation is the idea, old stock, the founding settler people, in other words. We're all under attack, and they want us replaced. And so the immigration policy has nothing to do with economics. I mean, they claim it does, but it doesn't. Right now, they pretend to worry themselves into an ulcer over all the people of my generation who are retiring, and there'll be a big gap in the workforce. But we've got 1.2 million Canadians out of work. Where's the gap?
It's the same lie they tell all over the West. The other gem is low skill, like we need more high skill immigration, followed by low birth rates. Who's going to look after us when we're old? Now, how can that be so? In all these supposedly developed, formerly first world European countries, it's an outright excuse to move the vast, less developed, coloured nations into ours. But the joke about it is, like, take, for example, one of those countries we import a lot of people from is India. But India is set to become the third largest economy in the world, right? So, and I got absolutely damn sure England is still sending them money, as they were to China up until recently. I don't know that they've actually stopped.
Well, I know India is still a major recipient of Canadian foreign aid, and you're right. It's to its credit, it's a developing country. It has a lot of impressive engineering, science, and great, more power to them. But build India. Don't come here. And we're told we have a skill shortage. Yeah, but what are the type of people coming in skilled at? Well, they might be cab drivers after a bit. Not very good cab drivers, but cab drivers. Well, white people can drive cabs. That's one of the major shifts in 40 years. When I first started traveling politically and you hail a cab at the airport, almost always there'd be a white guy. Now, if you get a white guy, you embrace him as a long lost brother. In fact, a few years ago, the guy who picked me up at the airport was white. I said, I think you must be a dying breed. He said, I am. I'm one of the very few white cab drivers still left in Winnipeg. Because as these third worlders, mostly Muslims or Sikhs, take over a taxi company, they hire usually only their own people. All the just anti-discrimination stuff that we've had hammered into our heads for half a century, that doesn't apply to them. But I guess my point is that we're not lacking skills, and where we are, we ought to be training our own people. They say we've got a doctor shortage. Well, that's probably true because we have so many immigrants coming in. We do have a doctor shortage, but why should we bring doctors from the third world where they're needed back in their home country? It's a very complicated technical thing why we aren't training enough doctors, but that would be a solvable problem if we would simply have the will to do it.
Jim, would you like to come in with a question or a comment? Or
you're very on the money there with this business of skill shortages. We have a massive overseas student program in Australia, and it's cheaper to import people to study at our institutions, and then they migrate as immigrants to fill roles. And we've found that in the last 10 to 15 years in particular, China and India are dominating those areas, and certain other odd places like Nepal, Singapore, and so on. And we're finding many of the people now working in engineering, medicine, and other skills are people who've migrated to Australia by virtue of being overseas students. I'm sure you have the same situation in Canada. The second point I'd make is that in this so-called globalised economy, you would wonder why you would say import a, say, Indian computer expert when he can just as easily run your business for you in New Delhi. There's no reason why he can't. Therefore, coming back to your original point, Paul, it's replacement. One, it's replacement. And two, if I can use the word, it's also cleansing from all sorts of professions. I take it you would concur with that assessment.
Yeah, you've explained the rather mysterious ways of the student visa program in Canada. We have a very active program to educate people, almost all from the third world. So they enter Canada on a student visa, and they're supposed to leave, when their education's through, but they don't. And the government has changed the rules and changed them so that, well, they now will move to the top of the column for immigration because, well, they've got Canadian experience. They're being trained here. So essentially, we're getting far more immigrants than even the official numbers would show you. As you say, they will be replacing native-born Canadians in many professions. They already, just on an anecdotal basis, seem to be doing that in pharmacies. Pharmacists are, again, it's hard to find a white one. Not because pharmacy is a disreputable occupation or not a lucrative one, but we're just being swamped. And the idea of protecting our own is in the political milieu of Canada today, a heresy. I mean, if you talk about, well, we ought to be preserving the founding settler people of this country and our dominance. Well, I mean, you must be some sort of a just dead end boot boy racist, and yet that's an entirely healthy reaction to protect your own people, your own family is something healthy and honorable, not depraved and disgusting. But we come back to who controls much of the mass media, and so they pumped out this self-hatred. Self-hatred is a really corrosive thing. If I could get people to say one thing and to feel it and to internalize it, it will be guilty no more. We're guilty of nothing. Well, I mean, individually, we might have done some bad things, of course. I'm not saying we're gods or supermen, but as a people, in fact, if we were so racist, as our government is always apologizing for having been in the past, why is it that people from around the world, from the third world, are beating down the doors to come to this racist country? As it's the same in Australia.
Another question, Paul, is what does the local Inuit, what do the native Canadians, well, I don't know what the politically correct term is, so I'm just going to say it, what do the Indians think of it? Do they embrace this tidal wave of immigration?
That's a tough question. I have known some Indian leaders who are enlightened on the matter, and feel that the newcomers will not be as daft or generous as the Europeans. The newcomers, for the most part, are not, I don't know if I should use the term crippled, but crippled by a Christian legacy of loving your neighbor, and not readily controlled by guilt. And our rotten elite have hammered white guilt at us for at least half a century. So, and I think the wise Indian leaders realize that if the new majority in Canada is Chinese or Muslim, they'll have they will get short shrift from them when they say, well, from time immemorial we were on this land, and the white man came. Yeah, the white man came and got most of it by treaty. It wasn't stolen. But the official line is, we were the colonists. We did all these, ruin their culture. Virtually nobody is bold enough to say, but what culture? You'd sat on this continent for 10,000 years. Did you ever build a road? Did you build a jet engine, a hospital, a hydro generator? No. You were, in the words of Thomas Hobbes, primitive man was his life was mean, nasty, brutish, and short. You were constantly massacring your neighbors, genociding your neighbors, and this would be extremely controversial. You probably genocided my ancestors, because there's very powerful anthropological evidence that there are Europeans in North America, both on the West Coast and the East Coast, before or coexistent with the people we now call Indians. And what happened to them? That's never been answered, but it might well be that they got genocided. The nonsensical myth of the noble Indian who was the steward of the land, absolute nonsense. Although their tools were primitive, they nearly exterminated a number of the large herds of deer that once roamed, a few thousand years ago in North America. So they were not exactly as they're portrayed now as earth-hugging hippies. they weren't. So the reaction to immigration, you hear very little formally, because they're too busy playing the guilt card and collecting big time. I mean, shoveling money out at Native Indians is practically a federal government pastime. The taxpayer is absolutely brutalized by
It's destructive too, isn't it? Because what do they spend it on? Importing hooch into liquor-free areas.
Well, in the previous conservative governments under Stephen Harper, any Indian who had attended a residential school, and these were basically boarding schools, and the Indians were sent to these schools in many areas because they were migratory. They were migratory. It was hard to educate them, and also there were very few in numbers in many cases, so it was hard to educate them in a given geographic area. So they'd be pooled together in a residential school where they'd stay for about 9 months of the year. Well, there's been a great hoo-ha about the abuse, and their culture was taken from them, and they were forced to learn English and told not to speak their native language, but the policy, the purpose of the schools on the part of the Dominion government was to try to move the people from the Indians from the Stone Age, beginning in 1880, to the edge of the modern age, where they could participate in a modern society. That was the goal. Well,
that's a very distinct point, because the expansion of European civilization made it unviable for let's call them slowly developed people to revert or halt at their position. They were thrown in the deep end. And it's you mentioned art culture before, but that's a very interesting point to assess the growth of a people. Take, for instance, Aboriginal art. Now, white man, he went through from the cave paintings through to the Renaissance and wonderful depictions of reality, and then he ended up in the smash jam of abstract expressionism to the complete nihilism. And we look at, say, Aboriginal, or in your case, the Indian people, and their art culture is arrested at that first stage. Do you understand what I'm saying? They're
yes, sort of the the two-dimension that used to be art.
It means they have not had that journey through enlightenment, and sadly to the stage where we're at, which is some sort of spiritual disillusionment. I'll just ask Jim if he wants to come in and make a comment.
Yeah, the Canadian and the Australian experience have some definite things in common. Our Aboriginal peoples did live in the Stone Age. That's certainly true. Like the native people in Canada, there's been a division of opinion developing amongst them over this issue of immigration. Now, we actually have a big debate on here of putting a so-called Indigenous voice into the Australian Constitution. And one of the most remarkable things in it is sometimes it's self-interest, sometimes it's awareness, who knows, but the number of Aborigines who are actually coming out against it. And they're actually suggesting that they're not going to get anything out of this voice in the Constitution at all. And even that it might put their cause backwards by a long time. I think we've discussed before, it would be very, very hard here, even harder perhaps than you'd have in Canada, for any of these third world migrants to have the slightest degree of sympathy for them at all. Because unlike the Indians of North America, alcohol and other things ravaged the Aboriginal world in the late 19th century, early 20th century, putting a lot of these people into complete marginalisation. And whatever it is that they think they possess now as the result of a land rights movement, it's very clear that it will be lost very, very quickly as Australia becomes, to use the phrase of the late 80s and 90s, part of Asia. So our migration experience, a little bit maybe different to yours, but very, very parallel. in many ways. And always in the immigration debate, and I'll put it back to you, Paul, and to our compere, every time you raise the issue of immigration, it's always, what about the Aborigines? What about the Aborigines? And I've taken to saying, well, can you produce to me a single Aborigine you've ever asked, ever consulted, ever said to them, would you like Australia to be a multiracial, multicultural society? One of the funniest things I've ever seen is trying to turn the Aborigines into part of multiculturalism. They're not part of it on first principles. They can't be part of it. Does any of this resonate with you, Paul? And I'll give it back to our host.
Yes, that is for some decades has been one of these cheap shots that's supposed to end the debate. Well, you don't have any right to complain about immigrants. You're not an Indian, a Native person. It actually it proves absolutely nothing. First of all, in many cases, or in some cases, they welcomed the Europeans. They could see benefits from what the Europeans brought and shared with them. But ultimately, in realpolitik, it doesn't matter. You either control a piece of geography or you don't. If you prefer not to exercise control and let others come and take control, they will, and you will be out. That's the native people in Australia and Canada were not able, for a variety of reasons, to hang on to their piece of geography. If they even really had a sense that it was, they were very, in Canada anyway, very regional people. They didn't have a sense of a country. They might have a sense of a small geographic area where they had hunted traditionally for a while. Not even, as we're always being told, since time immemorial. The populations ebbed and flowed. Tribes were massacred or starved to death. Other ones took over the territory. It was. Did you in Australia? Our public meetings started with this sort of ritual. We meet tonight on the traditional grounds of whatever.
Yeah.
Well,
we've got this thing called Welcome to Country. Welcome to Country is younger than me. In fact, it was devised in the 1970s by an Aboriginal comedian and one other called Ernie Dingo. And at the time, there was a meeting, and I don't know whether, I believe it was being held overseas, and all these other tribal groups had some sort of welcoming ritual, but the Aboriginals didn't have any, so they just made it up on the spot. They started sort of dancing around with, branch twigs and whatever, and made a smoke fire, and that is now hallowed in Australian understanding of rich Aboriginal tradition. But like you said about the tribe there, and we could say about the Indian tribes in America, which if you wanted to, if we all left and everybody was handed back what many centuries or millennia ago they called their own, which tribe would you give it to? Which tribe?
That's actually a big issue with this voice to Australian Parliament at the moment. Some Aboriginal groups are saying, well, who will you consult? There were originally 300 Aboriginal tribes and clans. Many of them, unfortunately, have disappeared with time. Who would you consult? Who for that purpose is an Aborigine? They're not a nation, they're a collection of peoples. And no one really knows. And as we've been arguing as nationalists for a long time, that the voice to the Constitution has got nothing to do with Aborigines at all. It's all about disintegrating the Australian nation based on the European style. Once you do that, that opens Australia to colonisation by somebody else. And I suspect, maybe dark in the background of some Aboriginal person's minds, they're actually realising that that must be the reality of things.
I say, I'm sorry, I was just going to lead with this. I say that we've got one thing in common with this entire program, and that is our connection to the United States. For instance, I read recently a Canadian shared it on Twitter that the FBI provided support to Ottawa police during convoy protests, which means that Trudeau was obviously getting assistance, advice, etc., from the main controllers in the US / global headquarters. Now, that's where I lay the blame. And if you want to take it even further, it then assumes a very Zionist flavour. Your thoughts, Paul?
Yeah, I think a lot of these trends are part of the Zionist effort to weaken us, undermine us, and break us up into and make us into a multicultural, multiracial society. I pay a lot of attention to advertising, particularly on television, and the content is just absolutely cancerous. You would think every other couple is a mixed race couple if you go by what you see on advertising. It's not. They're about 5% of Canadian couples are mixed race, and this all comes from the top. It's part of the psychological warfare against us, just like the guilt warfare that goes on, where our government is always apologizing to one minority or another for something that was done in the past, not for the many crimes the present Trudeau government has committed, but basically what old stock Canada did. About this business of we stole their land. Meetings here begin with a ritual. Well, quite often, we meet this evening on the unceded land of the whatever tribe who have occupied it since time immemorial, etc., which is almost always bullshit. In fact, a writer from Maclean's magazine went to such I think it was a school board meeting a few years ago in Waterloo, Ontario, and he heard this, and he thought, well, that's not the history I learned. So anyway, he went and researched it. See, the implication is we stole their land. Okay, well, what happened in this particular area? After the American Revolution, during the American Revolution, Mohawk Indians under Chief Joseph Brant sided with the British. They lived in what's now the United States, but they sided with the British and were loyal to the Crown. So after the Crown lost, Joseph Brant and his tribe were invited to come to what would become Canada, what was then Upper Canada, or now the province of Ontario, and they were granted a tract of land along the Grand River. Okay, well, by General Haldeman? Where did General Haldeman get that land? Well, he bought it from another tribe, and I think it was the tribe is called the Neutral. So that land was duly bought by the British Crown and given to Joseph Brant, who incidentally came to Canada with slaves. Black slaves, and that's a kind of important chunk of land in southwestern Ontario. Over the years, parts of that land were sold off by the Mohawk Indians to white settlers. They didn't steal it, and so the present little city of Waterloo, where there are two world-class universities, that place, the land there had been duly bought from the Indians from the Mohawks, who had been granted it by General Haldeman, who had bought that land from the previous tribe, the new neutrals. And if you're really curious, you might say, well, where do the neutrals get it? Well, I'll tell you. Around 1650, they genocided the previous owners of the land and took it. So, this invocation, which I promised to abolish. If I was mayor of Hamilton, we wouldn't start any meeting with that. We'd start with the Lord's Prayer. And if that really super offended you, you can butter off. It inculcates guilt that somehow we're bad, we're illegitimate. And I'm absolutely convinced that only Europeans can be controlled by guilt. I've been to Japan a number of times, and I've a fair number of Japanese friends, and there are ways to control them, but guilt is not one. Family shame, very, very powerful. But I said at one point, well, don't you have Holocaust memorials to all the Jews that supposedly went up in smoke in National Socialist Germany? And they look at you. They don't want to be rude. They look at you as you're daft. You're crazy. What are you talking about? Why should we give a flying flip about people? And equally, why should we, as Canadians? Like, it's now illegal. We have a state religion, but it's not Allah or Buddha or anything like that. It's Holocaust, and it's now illegal in Canada to deny the Holocaust. So what I suggest to people is this. Look, I'm not allowed to offer an opinion on this, but let me put it this way. The Holocaust, whatever it was, I think you'll agree, didn't happen in Canada. It didn't happen to Canadians. Canadians didn't do it. And I think we fought the guys who supposedly did do it. We're good guys. Here's a quarter. Call someone who cares if you want to lay the Holocaust on me. I don't give a damn.
Jim, you look like you've been wanting to say something.
Look, I think that I'll tell you a little story which shows, I suppose, how little both sides in the discussion never really appreciated what the real issues were. But in the very early processes of settlement in Australia, there were some Aboriginal groups living around a place called the Hawkesbury River, and the British authorities considered that they were being a bit of a nuisance or something like that. So they sent some soldiers up there to look into the matter and sort it out. So the soldiers, being very traditional, got out their pieces of paper with the Riot Act on it, and they nailed it up on the trees, and they read the Riot Act out to the local Aboriginal person who turned up to hear it. And as one of our great Australian nationalists, Percy Stevenson, said, it wasn't just history that laughs, it was actually the kookaburras. And quite frankly, I think there's been so much misunderstanding over the years between the two groups. But it now boils down to a situation where Australia is now open to recolonisation. That's the real question. So either the guild industry or either that part of the Aboriginal groups that want to make money out of this industry or anything like that, it's now all over now. It's all over now. And we have to get down to the serious questions. And you might know they had a number of court cases here, Paul, in the 1980s and 90s that supposedly conferred Aboriginal title on certain lands. And a lot of these are in the northern parts of Australia, where, surprise, surprise, our government is now talking about massive development of agriculture, of wind farms, of new types of hydrogen, of energy, of solar power and all of this. And the workers will all be drawn from India and other parts of Asia. Well, it would seem to me that if there is any Aboriginal voice at all, they better get on with the job, because they won't be around too much longer either. And I have to agree with you completely. The guild industry is something that does only work against Europeans. Why that is so, well, we could talk 1,000 things about it, but it's unhelpful. I didn't shoot an Aboriginal person, and I've got reason to believe a few Aborigines were cleansed off some lands in the 19th century. It's grossly overstated. There's a number of books on it that shows that it is overstated. There were some Aboriginal groups that even put up a resistance to it. But there was an Aboriginal tribal leader in Western Australia, the only one who actually had a treaty with the British over the workings of entry and whatnot into his lands. So it's a very, very mixed thing. It's not clear. But one thing is clear. You have an ancient culture, yes, it's on the land space, and you have the modern European culture, which is on the land space. And this time next century, neither of them are going to be on the land space. And I think that that's the dialogue that Australia needs to actually have. And guilt ain't part of it. I don't feel guilty. Guilty for what? For one of my ancestors who might have done some minor crime? That's not my problem. Would I have poisoned the flower? No. Would I have shot an Aboriginal man? No. But remember too, some British settlers were hanged for crimes against Aboriginal persons. And that is true. And it was made very clear that violence against Aborigines was not to be accepted. And several people were hanged for murder and other crimes against them. Did we do any of this? No, we didn't. And we live with certain results, but we're not the guilty parties. And you used the phrase together a moment ago, give me a quarter and dial someone who cares. Well, in a way, it's, I won't use the same words, but I'll just say we didn't do it. We white Australians, whatever it was, we white Australians didn't do it. And if you want to go blame someone, blame the colonial authority. Don't blame me. I think that's the way to look at it. Don't blame me.
I think that's a very powerful response, and one we have to make. The guilt avalanche has to be refuted and confronted. And I think that that writer's story about the land in Waterloo, Ontario, and tracing it back very calmly, it was not stolen. Well, yeah, I guess it was stolen in the sense that the neutral tribe massacred or genocided the previous Indians, but it was then bought from the neutrals, given to the Mohawks, who sold off portions of it for money, and that suddenly diffuses the guilt. And I think you're right. The Native Indians in Canada and the European founding settler people are going to have to work together, because neither of us will be here, or we will be in a terrible minority position with newcomers who don't like us. They've been fed on a diet of what a horrible group of racists we are, that we have no legitimacy, and there's no reason to believe that they will treat us well, considering the way, let's say, the Chinese or the East Indians or Muslims in general treat their own minorities. When we become a minority, I don't think it's going to be very pretty. And the same thing with the Indians, because the old guilt ticket isn't going to work. The new masters, if that's the way it turns out, are going to say, "Hey, that was all past history. That was between you and the European founding settler people, not us. We're not going to give you any tax money for wrongs you think you suffered 100 years ago or 200 years ago." So their glory days will be over as well.
Well, as we near the end of, we come up to the hour mark, I will start to wind down. I'll just ask you, what are your thoughts on the recent American primaries? Have you
mean the election?
Yeah,
the election. Very disappointing. I mean, I guess I accepted the mainstream media predictions that the Republicans would come roaring in with substantial gains in the House and take control, and probably take control of the Senate. Neither of those two propositions is at all clear now. There are about 40 seats in the House and 3 in the Senate that are still undecided. Probably the Republicans will have a slim majority in the House, which will be a gain. The Senate is, I think, too close to call. I'm disappointed. I thought the complete bungling and hash that Joe Biden or Donald Trump calls him Sleepy Joe has made of things, the absolute white-hating administration he presides over, with one of his admirals, a transgender thingy from Pennsylvania. I mean, the clowns are in charge.
Yeah.
America is no longer really credible as a world power. It may have a lot of big toys, big nuclear toys and things like that, but it has proved itself to be a nasty globalist. The war in the Ukraine and so on. I would have thought there would have been a much bigger reaction. There was a reaction, but not to the extent that I would have thought. That I'm a bit mystified.
Now, you mentioned the prominent queers in Biden's circus. Let's look at your Prime Minister Trudeau has made an appearance on Drag Race. That's a TV show that normalises queerness. Is he a bit of a homosexual, Trudeau? I mean,
I'm not really in a position to say. He sure is awfully favorable to the transgender. He brought in legislation to make it an offense to discriminate against somebody on the basis of their sexual identification. So, if I feel like a woman today, you've got to treat me like a woman. I don't. If I feel like a cat, you have to put out a bowl of cream for me. I mean, this is mental illness, and I wonder. I don't idealize the Red Chinese, and I know there are many flaws and many problems there. But I wonder what the militarists in Peking think. When you've got a president of the United States who one of his major goals is to eliminate racism and sexism in the armed forces, and to accommodate the lesbians and so on, and this must be incomprehensible to the Chinese, and they must wonder, do we have to fear these people? I mean, maybe they do have big toys, but could they put together a coherent army? There was a time when there would be no question about it, but I'd say now there is a question, especially now that the officer corps is being ruthlessly propagandized about the anti-racism and all that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question I raise now because in Australia they're making armament noises, and it's all in relation to Taiwan and China's ambitions there. And, we had a former Prime Minister, a former Conservative Prime Minister, come out and suggest that we need national service, etc. And I asked, but to fight for what? One, it's none of our business. But two, even if we were fighting to defend Australia, for who are we fighting to defend it for? These are the questions. Well, the West has gone quite mad. You see footage out of American cities, and just out of the corner of your eye, you'll see someone dressed as a dog, on all fours running across the crowd. But I mean, where have we come to? Does it have parallels with the decadent decline of Rome? Is there anything? But it's a disappearance into fantasy, a disconnect that is being wholly encouraged. Everything is being encouraged. But it also, and I tell you this, Paul, it has the added benefit of aiding that globalist agenda of depopulating the planet, because while people are, having sex with the same gender or taking their genitals off to become some other definition of the sex, they're not procreating, they're not adding to the stocks. And Jim.
Yeah, look, one thing, Paul, just to, from my point of view, wind up on, you forward to us various bulletins with which you are associated. And you said to me offline before you didn't have your red ensign flag with you today. And as you can see, I have a Southern Cross behind me, which is commonly known now as the Australian symbol. It's an identity symbol. And my question to you is you have that delightful red ensign, and it has a number of aspects to it. Could you actually explain it in greater detail so a dumb Aussie gets it?
Well, the red ensign was the designated flag of Canada from, I believe, 1923 to 1965. And it has up in the top left-hand corner the Union Jack. It has the background of red. Then it has a crest, and in the crest there are the symbols of England, Ireland, Scotland, and France. And then there are three green maple leaves, and their stems come together. And the maple leaves have a number of possible symbolisms. One is it would be the English, French, Europeans, and then the rest of the Europeans. Another is the Native Indians, the original founding people, the French, English, etc., and then the newcomers thereafter. But as a symbol, it is extremely powerful. The Union Jack, of course, has the Christian cross. The Union Jack suggests that the dominant language in Canada is English. Our laws and parliamentary system come from England. It's a powerful symbol of who we were. And that's why they didn't want it. They want us. They were about to replace us through mass immigration in 1965. The dark forces that were pulling the strings realized they had to get rid of that flag, because that would be a visual contradiction to what they were trying to do. And incidentally, recently, the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, which is heavily funded by the federal government, has declared that the red ensign is a hate symbol. Now, that was too much for some of the Legion groups and others who said, well, you know, we fought under that in a world war. Come on, how can it be a hate symbol? But, you know, says, as often happens, they went too far. But that's what's behind it, yeah.
Okay.
Speaking of veterans, I noticed Trudeau made a point of being not in Canada when the Veterans Day came up.
Yeah, he apparently is in Cambodia today. I mean, God knows why, but
a spiritual pilgrimage to the land of the Khmer Rouge, I think.
Well, yeah, that would perhaps be more ideologically down his alley. No, he has nothing but contempt. Well, he has nothing but contempt for our past. Because it's a past he rejects. And it was soon after he was elected prime minister, he gave an interview to the New York Times where he said that Canada was the first post-national state. Not quite sure what he meant by that, but
now I know what he means.
We know what he means, unfortunately.
It's been great to talk to both you and Jim, Paul. We will, of course, do this again. As they say, there's a lot of stuff I wanted to chat about, but as tangents take hold, you drift off and expatiate on different points. What are you? I'll just ask before we say goodbye. What are you doing with yourself now that the mayoral campaign's over?
Well, there's a national inquiry into the government's invoking the Emergencies Act, or it used to be the War Measures Act, to smash the truckers' convoy. So I've prepared a brief submitted to the inquiry, and I'm right now on a speaking tour of Western Canada. Right now in Vancouver, I'm doing a couple of talks here, and then I'll be in Victoria. Then I go back home.
Okay. So you're obviously in a hotel room there.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I look forward to speaking to you again, and good luck with all that you're doing.
Thanks, and
Hello.
great seeing you again, Dr. Jim.
Talk soon.
See you later.
Yeah.